Tom Brady finished his career with 7 Super Bowl rings, which is more than any other player in the history of the league. That total actually beats out every single NFL franchise as well. If we look at the standard metrics used to evaluate quarterbacks, Brady had already secured his spot as the greatest of all time before he ever decided to leave New England. The most fascinating part of this story isn't the hardware he collected along the way. The real story is that the most pivotal choice he ever made was walking away from the very organization that helped him win those first 6. But to really understand Tom Brady, we have to go back about 2,400 years where a Greek philosopher named Plato created the famous story, the Allegory of the Cave. In that story, Plato describes 3 prisoners who were chained in a cave from birth, forced to stare at a wall where shadows dance in front of them. These prisoners gave names to the shadows and competed to see who could actually predict their movements most accurately. Because this was all they had ever seen, they thought those flickering lights and those passing shadows was reality itself. But it wasn't. For 20 years, Tom Brady lived in the most successful cave the NFL has ever seen. But the thing was, he didn't even realize he was in one. If you want to understand the cave that Brady was actually in, we have to look at what the Patriot Way actually was at its peak. It was the scheme over everything, it was to do your job, and it was to shut up. Between the years of 2001 and 2019, New England reached 9 Super Bowls and walked away with 6 trophies. They managed to play in the AFC Championship game in 13 out of 19 seasons, which is a level of consistency we just don't see in professional sports ever. The culture Bill Belichick built was based on total selflessness, where players didn't have names on their practice jerseys and no individual ego was allowed to be bigger than the team. The mantra was simple: do your job and win. Bill Belichick stands as the greatest coach in the history of the game, and we aren't here to argue against that. In Plato's story, the cave doesn't need a villain to function, and the person casting the shadows isn't necessarily a bad guy. He's simply the one who controls what the prisoners are allowed to see. Belichick created a system that was so rigid and so focused on winning a specific way that the system eventually became the entire world for everyone involved. Brady didn't just participate in this system, he embraced it with everything he had. He took pay cuts year after year and restructured his deals so the front office could afford to put better talent around him. By 2017, his cap hit was only $14 million. Even though he was 40 years old and the reigning MVP, he was playing for about 25% of what he could have made on the open market. He chose to defer to the scheme, checking the ball down when coaches told him to, and the result was a mountain of wins. In the original Allegory, the prisoners spend their time naming shadows and fighting for respect based on who understands the game the best. Brady played the game better than anyone else, by stacking up rings, MVP trophies, and division titles. He was winning the shadow game at a level the league had never witnessed, with 6 rings and 3 MVPs proving his dominance. The part of Plato's writing that most people overlook is that the prisoners aren't actually suffering or miserable. They're comfortable because the shadows are familiar and predictable, and they feel a sense of accomplishment because they are good at interpreting them. Tom wasn't stuck in a toxic environment in New England, but instead he was thriving inside a structure that generated more success than any quarterback had ever seen. This is exactly why the cave is so hard to recognize while you're still inside of it. When you're winning at that rate, the walls don't feel like a limitation, they just feel like the correct way to run a football team. However, things began to really change around 2017 as a relationship between the star quarterback and his head coach started to fracture. While they always shared a mutual respect, there was never much warmth there, and the tension finally became public. Alex Guerrero, who was Brady's trainer and close partner, had his sideline access taken away, which forced the pair to work out of a maintenance shed at the stadium. When Bill Belichick finally traded Jimmy Garoppolo to San Francisco, it only happened because Brady made it clear that the situation had reached its breaking point. The system was still winning games, but for the first time in 2 decades, the walls were starting to close in. The thing about Plato's Allegory is that the prisoner who actually leaves didn't escape on his own. He didn't wake up one morning and just realize, hey, I want to start a new reality. In the actual story, there was someone else who came and loosened his chains. And once he loosened his chains, he was pulled towards the light. And at first he resisted because the cave was the only home he'd ever known. For Tom Brady, the New England Patriots loosened those chains without even meaning to. Going into the 2019 season, Brady wanted a 2-year, $50 million commitment from the team. This wasn't exactly an outrageous ask for a QB who had just secured his 6th championship ring. He was coming off the season with over 4,300 yards and 29 passing touchdowns at age 41, which meant he was still playing at an all-pro level. The Patriots simply wouldn't give him that deal though. What they offered instead was a contract extension that looked like a commitment on the surface but included 2 voidable years, which meant New England could move on from him whenever they felt like it. Brady later admitted that he knew before the 2019 season even kicked off that it would likely be his final year with the franchise. So he played the season out and he played it well. The Patriots finished 12-4 behind an elite defense while Tom threw for over 4,000 yards. But there was no hiding what the contract situation had already signaled to everyone involved. The organization wasn't willing to bet on him the same way he had always bet on them. and that realization changed everything. In January 2020, the Tennessee Titans traveled to Gillette Stadium for a wildcard game and walked out with a 20-13 victory. Brady's very last pass as a Patriot ended up being a pick-six. It wasn't some grand symbolic ending, but rather a standard football ending that happens when a team finally runs out of answers. He walked off that field in Foxborough and never returned to the building as a member of the Patriots. After the move became official, Brady told a friend that Belichick didn't know what he was losing. That specific line carries a lot more weight than you might think. It isn't just bitterness from a player who felt slighted. This was a man who had finally turned around to see the fire for the first time, realizing the shadows on the wall had a source and that he was just as responsible for the light as the system was. After 20 years of winning under one specific structure, he was only now starting to grasp his own individual role in that success. In March of 2020, the news became official when Tom Brady signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on a deal worth about $30 million per year. The contract included 2 years of fully guaranteed money, which was the commitment New England had refused to put on paper. Tampa gave him everything he wanted in less than a week. The reaction across the NFL was exactly what you would expect. Analysts ran endless segments debating whether Brady could even survive without the help of Bill Belichick. They questioned if the system had carried him all those years and wondered if a 43-year-old QB joining a franchise that hadn't seen the playoffs in 13 years was a massive mistake. The remaining cave dwellers in Plato's story couldn't imagine that anything outside of their dark room was real. From inside the shadow game of New England, the idea that Brady could win somewhere else without that specific scheme looked like a man stumbling toward a light that would eventually blind him. But the prisoner that escaped doesn't fall down, doesn't get blinded, and he doesn't die. He just has to deal with the pain first. There was no OTAs and there was no preseason for the 2020 start of the season. Brady had to get acclimated to a new offensive system under Bruce Arians that focused on deep shots and aggressive play calling as opposed to the checkdowns he was used to in New England. This style was almost the total opposite of the checkdown, scheme-heavy football he had mastered for 2 decades. He had to learn all of this at 43 years old with no in-person training camp because the 2020 offseason was entirely virtual. Plato describes the moment a prisoner is dragged into the light as something that is genuinely painful. It isn't just metaphorically uncomfortable for the person involved. His eyes have adjusted to the darkness for his entire life, so the sudden brightness of the sun completely overwhelms his senses. He stumbles around because he can't see properly, and his first instinct isn't to feel wonder, but to turn around and run back to the safety of what he knows. Brady's first game in a Buccaneers uniform was a 34-23 loss to the Saints. He had 2 interceptions with the entire offense feeling disjointed and messy. The media consensus formed almost instantly that the experiment was a failure before it really even started. People claimed that he was too old, that the system was a bad fit, and he clearly couldn't function without Belichick. Tampa Bay continued to lose ground as the season progressed. They dropped 2 straight games to the Rams and the Chiefs in late November by identical scores of 27-24. At that point in time, they sat at 7-5 and were stuck in 3rd place in their own division. The game against the Chiefs, where Tyreek Hill caught 13 passes for nearly 237 yards before the game even reached halftime, was the absolute low point of the journey. In the Allegory of the Cave, this is the exact moment where the prisoner is most likely to give up and quit. The sunlight feels too much to handle, his eyes aren't adjusting fast enough, and the memory of the cave is still fresh in his mind. Those familiar shadows are right there waiting for him just a few steps back down the path. But Brady didn't go back into the darkness. He decided to push harder in the other direction. Following the bye week that came after the tough Chiefs loss, he began pushing the coaching staff to commit more to the running game. Leonard Fournette had been cut by Jacksonville at the start of the year, but he was starting to get more carries and the offense finally found its rhythm. From week 14 through week 17, Brady averaged 330 passing yards and 3 TDs per game. He finished that stretch with a passer rating of 126.9, which isn't the stat line of a man stumbling into the light. Those are the numbers of a man whose eyes have finally adjusted to his surroundings. The reason it worked was that Brady was learning to see the game in a brand new way. During his time in New England, the offense focused on precision and short routes to minimize any potential risk. The Tampa offense asked him to trust deeper throws and let Mike Evans and Chris Godwin win their matchups down the field. He started using Rob Gronkowski in ways we hadn't seen in years, and Antonio Brown provided some of the sharpest route running in the league whenever he was locked in. Leonard Fournette gave them a physical ground game that forced defenses to play fair, which opened up everything else for the passing attack. The defense played at an elite level all season long. Shaq Barrett was a force off the edge with Devin White flying around the field, and Carlton Davis was locking down the best receivers in the game. They carried the team through the struggles of October and November while the quarterback got comfortable in the new system. By the time the playoffs actually arrived, Tampa Bay didn't need the defense to carry the load anymore because they had become one of the most complete teams in the NFL. Plato's prisoner doesn't just tolerate the light once his eyes adjust to the brightness. He starts to realize that everything he saw back in the cave was only a tiny fraction of what was actually real. Brady's eyes had adjusted to his new reality. And what he was about to see next was going to end the argument about who he really was as a player. Super Bowl 55 took place in February 2021 at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa. It featured Brady versus Mahomes, a rematch of earlier in the season, the old guard versus the new. The Chiefs happened to be the reigning champions, going up against the Tom Brady-led Tampa Bay Bucks that weren't even supposed to be there. However, when the clock finally hit 0, the Bucks had won 31-9 in an absolute demolition. Tom finished the night with 201 yards and 3 touchdowns, but he didn't actually need to carry the entire load himself. The Tampa defense stepped up and held Mahomes without a single touchdown for the first time in his playoff career, which allowed Brady to focus on managing the game. The most important number from that night wasn't found in the box score because it was the 7th ring that cemented his legacy. He had finally won a title without Bill Belichick or the rigid Patriot Way, and he did it in his very first year with the franchise that had been stuck in irrelevance for over a decade. If we look back to Plato, this is the exact moment where the prisoner finally stops looking at reflections and stares directly into the sun. He isn't just seeing shadows on a wall or trees in the distance, but he's finally witnessing the source of all light and understanding. Everything becomes clear in a way that was impossible back inside the cave, no matter how good he was at interpreting those flickering shapes. You can see the shift when you watch Brady standing on that field covered in confetti. This moment felt different not because of the trophy itself, but because of what the trophy proved to the rest of the world. For 20 years, the NFL had been locked in a heated debate about whether the success belonged to the quarterback or the coach. Now the answer was undeniable, and the look on Brady's face showed that he knew we finally had the truth. He was always stone-faced and brief in New England, but in Tampa, we saw a man who was actually having a blast. He was dancing on boats during the parade and stumbling out drunk, looking like a 43-year-old who finally remembered that football was supposed to be fun. That version of Tom had been waiting to come out for over 2 decades, but the cave simply didn't have room for that kind of personality. The 2021 season only made the argument stronger as Brady returned for his second year in Tampa and put up some of the best numbers of his entire life. He led the league with 5,316 passing yards and 43 touchdowns at age 44. His coach Bruce Arians told the media it would be a total travesty if Brady didn't win the MVP award that year. Even though Aaron Rodgers took home the trophy after a great season of his own, Tom still finished second in voting at an age where most guys are either retired or holding a clipboard on the sidelines. Belichick was a defensive mastermind who valued structure, while Tom's genius was always about reading the field and finding the open man. Those two styles worked perfectly together for a long time, but Tampa gave Brady a chance to play without a ceiling over his head. This is what it looks like when the prisoner stands in the full heat of the sun. He wasn't just seeing a new world, but he was realizing that the shadows he spent 20 years naming were only a tiny piece of the big picture. The rings he won in New England were definitely great, but the freedom and joy he found in Tampa was even better. He had spent his whole career in the dark, and now he finally had the perspective to see what he'd been missing. One of the most forgotten parts of Plato's story isn't that the prisoner that actually escaped just stands out in the sun for the rest of his life. He feels a deep responsibility to go back and tell the other prisoners what he actually witnessed when he's out there. The problem is the escaped prisoner's eyes had adjusted to the light, so he can't see clearly in the dark anymore. He starts to stumble and lose his way, which leads the other prisoners to believe that his journey actually ruined him rather than enlightened him. This brings us to October 3rd, 2021, when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers traveled to Gillette Stadium to face the New England Patriots. Brady walked back into his old home as a reigning champion with a 2-1 record, leading the most dangerous offense in the league against his former coach. The fans spent the pregame warm-ups chanting his name with a level of emotion that showed they knew exactly what he meant to that city. However, the second he stepped onto the grass to start the game, those cheers turned into a chorus of boos. That's a classic reaction of the cave when it encounters a prisoner who has been freed. The game turned out to be a gritty, strange affair where Brady didn't look his usual sharp self. He finished the night with 269 yards and 0 touchdowns, moving the ball between the 20s but failing to punch it into the end zone. With less than 2 minutes left, Brady took over and marched the team down the field with that signature calm that has defined his entire career. Ryan Suckup nailed the go-ahead kick with 1:57 left, and the Patriots couldn't find an answer before the final whistle blew. After the 19-17 victory, something happened that broke every unwritten rule in the NFL. Belichick waltzed straight into the visitors' locker room to find Brady, and the two of them talked behind closed doors for over 20 minutes. One Patriots player mentioned later that he had never seen a head coach enter an opponent's locker room like that in his entire career. We'll probably never know what was actually said during that meeting, but the fact it happened shows the massive weight of the history they shared. If you look at what happened in New England after Brady left, the decline is pretty hard to ignore. They went from 7 wins to 10 wins, then dropped to 8 and finally bottomed out with only 4 wins in 2023. The Patriots tried to keep the same old approach by cycling through different quarterbacks and doubling down on the Patriot Way. From their perspective inside the cave, this made perfect sense because that system had produced 6 rings over 2 decades. The people left behind couldn't see that the system and the player were one and the same, and that every shadow they had been watching for years was actually created by Brady. The cave refused to adjust its view, and the people inside just watched him struggle through a tough win and assumed he had lost his edge. They were looking at the situation completely backwards, failing to realize that he was the only one who could truly see. On February 1st, 2023, Tom Brady walked away from the game for good. When you step back and look at those final years in Tampa, the production is actually hard to believe. He ranked second in the entire league in passing yards during that stretch, sitting right behind Patrick Mahomes, who's nearly 20 years his junior. He was third in touchdowns, won a Super Bowl, and put himself right back into MVP conversation. If you strip the names off those stat sheets and showed them to a scout, they would tell you they were looking at a quarterback in the absolute prime of his early 30s. In the final part of Plato's Allegory, the freed prisoner realizes that seeing the sun changes everything about how he views his past. He finally understands that the reality he accepted inside the cave was just a cheap imitation of something much bigger and more powerful. Those shadows on the wall weren't necessarily fake at all, since he used them to navigate for years, but they were never the full picture. They were just a reflection of a reflection, and once he saw the source of light, he could never go back to believing the shadows were the ultimate truth. Tom's life today looks like a guy who found the light and decided to stay there. Between his ownership stakes and his new broadcasting career, there's a public comfort and a personality that the stone-faced version of him in Foxborough never allowed us to see. The personal costs of those final years were heavy, but he came out of the other side with a level of self-knowledge that 20 years of winning in one place never could have provided. And that's the core of Plato's message, which is that the journey towards the truth matters just as much as where you end up. Also, he was throwing shots at the commoners who refused to see the truth in the place they were living at the time, but that's neither here nor there. A philosopher who sees the sun doesn't just keep that secret to himself, but instead he goes back to show everyone else what he found. Brady did that every single Sunday he suited up for the Bucs. The biggest mistake people make with Plato's Allegory is thinking that it's a story about escaping failure. In reality, it's about escaping a version of success that feels so real and works so well that you never think to question it. For 20 years, Brady was the most successful prisoner in the history of the league, building a dynasty while living in the shadows. Then at 43 years old, he decided he wanted to see the sun. So there you have it. Subscribe if you're new, and watch this next video if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.